Hi, this is Esther Ludlow from Once Upon a Crime podcast. I want to thank Digital Hollywood for having me here today to talk some true crime. And we're going to get into some true crime stories in just a second. But I want to tell you a little bit about the podcast. As Cecily said, I started it 3.5 years ago. We have over 150 episodes, and it's a new true crime case every week. And one of the things about true crime podcasts is if you're into podcasts at all or into true crime, you know that they have really proliferated over the last couple of years. When I started, there wasn't a whole lot. Now there are so many different kinds of true crime podcasts, different formats that people can listen to. And so what I think that I do a little bit differently on Once Upon a Crime that my listeners keep coming back to and the show keeps growing is that I try to find some information that maybe you didn't know about a true crime case that maybe you thought you knew very well. So I cover well-known cases, from like Scott Peterson to the Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker kind of cases, but also some lesser known, like the Chowchilla school bus kidnapping that happened here in California in the 1970s. So I try to find, no matter if it's well-known or lesser well-known, I try to find information that you say, I didn't know that about that case, or I had never heard that before. And the way to do this is, it's not a law and order type of focus. It's more of let's get into the backstory, the story behind the story of real crime. So let me give you a couple of examples of that. What happens, I think, when we report on true crime cases, whether it's television shows or podcasts, is that what we know is the sound bites that we get from like television news stories when they come out. So what happens is that news comes out really quickly. We get these sound bites. These are the things that get told over and over, and it becomes the known narrative of the crime story. But what I like to do is find another narrative or find something that adds to the narrative to make it more interesting and make it more of a human interest story, not just the crime, the trial, the sentencing. So let me give you a couple of examples of some of those that I've done that I think that illustrate what Once Upon a Crime does and what it sounds like every week. So, So one of the first ones you may have heard of the name of Kitty Genovese. Kitty Genovese was a 28-year-old woman who was murdered in front of her apartment building in New York City in the 1960s. This became a major news story for a specific reason. It was actually a front page story in the New York Times on March 27, 1964. And I'm just going to read what the beginning of that story said. It said, for more than a half an hour, 38 respectable, law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab a woman in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. And this was what the narrative that came out right away. And of course, people wanted to know about this, is how could this happen? So this story would not only become the big news item in New York, but across the whole country. People expressed shock at how callous Americans, especially New Yorkers, as they were singled out at the time, were. What was the world coming to, people said. Television news programs features on Kitty Genovese's story had the 38 witnesses constantly being put out there in front of the news, that these people knew it was happening and nobody tried to stop it. So Mike Wallace even aired a report that was called Apathetic Americans. And the apathy was blamed on any number of factors, from increasing sex and violence on television, to the women's liberation movement, to the lack of church attendance now that Americans were starting to change that habit as well. But the overall story was the cold and impersonal nature of the city and its residents. So it called into question the basic humanity of Americans at that time. There was something even came out of it called the bystander effect, which was the phenomenon, the social psychology phenomenon, which said the more people that were around at a time when something happened, if somebody was in peril, the less chance that somebody would help because somebody else will do it. So it even came out in psychology, became a big story. So it was quite a to-do. It was a huge story, but there was many parts of it that were very inaccurate. So, for example, Several people actually called the police that night, and there were several ear witnesses, not eyewitnesses, but people that heard something and called the police. So we'll talk about the eyewitnesses in a second, but the ear witnesses, one of them was a man and his son. Son was like 12 years old, heard a woman yelling, looked out the window, called his dad over. They saw something, they couldn't tell what it was. This happened like at 3 a.m. in the morning, so there was pretty empty street. Most people were, fast asleep. And the thing that happened was this Kitty Genovese worked at a bar at a restaurant across town, so was coming home from her shift like very early morning hours. So this is why that timing was important. But they called the police, but at the time, you called the police switchboard, and they route you to another switchboard, and then maybe, they find out where you're at, and then they send you to another switchboard before they get you to the police officer. So this is what happened, is this man, Michael Hoffman, was on the phone trying to get a police officer there for like 5 minutes. And they said, okay, we got it. He hung up the phone, didn't hear anything else after that, figured it had taken care of, and that was the end of it. There was another woman who called the police, and I think there was more than one, but one definitely we know of, that she called the police, but they told her somebody had already reported it. So I think that happened several times. So that was the end of it. Now, as far as eyewitnesses, there were a couple that we can point to. Number one, right across the street from her apartment building was a doorman who watched the building across the street. He actually saw the attack happening in front of the building, but decided not to do anything. He is the one who later on would give the famous quote that, I didn't want to get involved. And he's the doorman, that's his job. But he had a phone in there, he didn't make a phone call. He said, I had a baseball bat, I thought about getting it, but I didn't. So that's kind of where that came from. There was another witness who was actually Kitty's friend. What happened in the Kitty Genovese case is that she got attacked in front of her building, and she was able to get herself around the side of the building. That's why nobody heard her anymore or saw anything after that, because her stairway was in the back of the building. So as she's going upstairs, somebody opens the door, and his name was Carl Ross. That was her neighbor across the hall, and that was her friend. He saw something happening down there, but was terrified. And the thing also that I found out about Carl Ross is that he was a very serious alcoholic, and he happened to be very drunk that night. So he said, I saw something, but I was terrified, and I shut the door. He didn't know what to do. He didn't call the police. He called a friend who lived across the way, and they talked for a few minutes while all this was happening. But here's the thing that I found out in my research that was never really reported in the news, maybe not until even the 2000s, is that Carl Ross was a gay man. And he was terrified to call the police because of harassment that he'd received for being a homosexual. And here's another thing that came out in research, is that Kitty Genovese was also gay. And she was in a relationship at the time and was living with her girlfriend in the apartment building where she was attacked. That had nothing to do with her attack at all. I want to put that out there. But the fact that that was buried for so long, we did not get that part of the story. And it was a very sad story because Kitty Genovese was brutally murdered. And her girlfriend was questioned the next day, but she was not questioned about the murder or suspects or anything like that. She really couldn't say anything. She was asleep at the time, never heard anything, never saw anything. But the fact that when she was questioned by police the next day for hours, all they were really asking her about was her suspected relationship status. So, which is totally irrelevant, but she was, that was the thing that they were focused on for whatever reason. And so Marianne lost, her best friend, her girlfriend, her life partner, was never able to grieve her openly because it was a gay relationship that even Kitty's family wasn't well aware of. And they never did really talk to Marianne, and she never really did get to talk to them. She moved away, and that was the end of that story. She had to grieve her girlfriend, alone, which was a really sad part of the story. But there's a couple of other aspects of the story. Again, finding these stories behind the story, I think, is like the part that's really interesting to me. So the 911 emergency call system in the United States was partially spawned by this case, by the Kitty Genovese murder, because they realized how long it was taking for the police to be able to respond, and they wanted to be able to not have that not have that delay when somebody was in danger. So that was one of the things that happened, which I thought was really interesting. One other, just kind of a side story, but also very interesting, is at the time when this story came out, there was a 12-year-old boy who heard about this story and thought it was terrible that this poor woman was killed so violently and nobody helped her. At least that's what he knew of it. And he vowed that he would always try to help somebody no matter, if he was able to, no matter what, he would try to help somebody who was in danger. And famously, he was the U.S. Airways pilot in 2009, Chesley Sully Sullenberger, who was piloting that plane that was in danger of crashing into the Hudson and was able to make a miracle landing and saved 155 people on board. And he still, to this day, says that was one of the reasons why he became this person who, no matter what, I'm going to try to save lives. And it became a huge story. Sully was a movie, and he was played by Tom Hanks, which I think is really amazing. So that's one. I tell you a really quick one more story that I found, and this is something that was not even a crime story until I did some research, and I thought there's a crime story here, was the story of Vincent van Gogh. Now, we know Vincent van Gogh as the tortured artist who, painted beautiful paintings, iconic paintings that now, sell for millions and millions of dollars, that he cut his own ear off and that he took his own life at the age of 37. Except that might not be true. And in the research that I did, I found that there was actually already another rumor about what had actually happened at the time, but it just never got out. It just never went anywhere. And the idea that he had committed suicide came from another artist named Emile Bernard, who went and talked to an art critic who then, this quote went into a paper. And he said, my best friend, my dear Vincent, is mad. Since I have found out, he's talking about him killing himself, I am almost mad myself. And that went out everywhere. So that was the narrative, that he had killed himself. But pretty much from the beginning, there was a lot of questions of whether that was actually true. One of the things is the gun was never found. And it's like, if you kill yourself, usually the gun is going to be found where you shot yourself. The idea was that he had shot himself with his pistol. The pistol was never found. And he was able to get back to his boarding house, which they said he wouldn't have been able to go that far length to be able to do it. And there was also an idea that there was some boys in town that used to bully him and harass him and just play pranks on him all day long. And there was one 16-year-old boy who was the son of a wealthy family from Paris that summered in Auvers, which is where Van Gogh was, that summered there. And he was very enamored of American culture and especially Western wear. He would walk around in his cowboy outfit and had a pistol on him all the time. And as people went back and did some research, they kind of figured out that probably where he had been to be able to get back to the boarding house, he also made a couple of comments because he didn't die right away. The doctor did come. He died of his wounds the next day. And they asked him, they didn't ask him what happened. They asked him, did you intend to kill yourself or did you try to kill yourself? And he said, yes, I think so, which is a strange comment. The other thing that he said was when they said, well, trying to kill yourself is a crime. And he said, do not, what is the word? I'm sorry. Do not accuse anyone else of this. I did this to myself. Now, they weren't asking about accusing anybody else, so that gave them that something was happening. The bullet wound was not a contact wound. They knew he had been probably shot from at least a foot away. So there was all of these things. Well, there was the 16-year-old boy. In the 1950s, he was actually interviewed in Life magazine, and he was still making fun of Vincent van Gogh and saying that guy was just, he was crazy, and they asked him about the gun. He said, I sold that gun to him. And but yet it was never found. And also everybody knew that Vincent van Gogh would never have a weapon. He was very against any kind of weapons of any sort. So there was some really interesting things that came out of that. And they realized is that if this did happen the way they thought it was an accidental shooting, he was trying to protect these young boys and just that became the narrative. So it's quite a different story with a true crime twist, a story that we thought we knew. And that is, there's much more to the story, but that's in episode 26. So that's just about my time. In every episode of Once Upon a Crime, I try to give, like I said, the story behind the story, and this is what I tried to do here with you today. I feel like the details of the story add to the understanding and maybe the motivation or the crime or how things unfolded, and maybe just human nature, which I find very fascinating, and listeners seem to really enjoy that as well. It's the details of these stories, I think, that makes the story stick with us in our memory and makes it think about it a long time afterwards that we've heard it. I do my very best to try to get the accurate story as possible in a compelling and memorable way. And that's kind of what I call putting the true into true crime. So I just want to thank again so much everyone for allowing me this opportunity to come today and tell you a couple of true crime stories and share that with you. So thank you so much for your time.